If you ask somebody, do you exist? If they say no, well, who is the one that is saying no?
Yeah.
So the only obvious answer is yes, I exist.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Soul Sessions with Creative Mind. I'm Deborah Burnt Maldonado. I'm here with Dr. Rob Maldonado.
Great to be here.
And we are about to enter a new series, Rob.
Yeah, we got some cool stuff coming up.
The topic is Jung and Yoga. So combining East and West philosophy. And one of the things we will discuss today is the ego. But before we begin, I do want to remind you to, if you're watching us on YouTube, click the button in the corner and make sure you subscribe to our channel. Also, if you're listening to us on Spotify, iTunes, or any other podcast service, go to our website, click on subscribe, and make sure you get every episode of Soul Sessions. And today's topic is the 3 ways the ego can either make you or break you. And it's an East-West perspective.
Yeah, it's part of the series of Jung and Yoga, where we look at East-West, and obviously the West, we mean Jungian psychology primarily, but we can also look at other things like neuroscience, and compare and contrast some of these elements, because it's such a cool idea, right, that we all arrive at the same place if we look for the truth.
Mm-hmm. The truth is one.
Well, the truth is always the truth, whether we approach it from the scientific perspective, from the yoga perspective, or any other way we approach it, we reach the same conclusion. And so, yeah, let's look at the ego. I'd like to dedicate this series to people that are experiencing autoimmune problems or autoimmune disorders. Some of the latest statistics indicate that about 1 in 9 persons, or 1 in 9 women, and 1 in 12 individuals, both men and women, are experiencing autoimmune problems. So hopefully some of these ideas help you deal with those kind of problems that come up.
Because a lot of what we deal with on a physical level are deeper psychological, emotional patterns that we're stuck in.
Absolutely.
So I love the story that you have to share that gives people an idea of what is the ego.
Yeah, so I was thinking it was Hermann Hesse that had written this story, but I don't really remember where it comes from, but it's an interesting story of a young man who wants to study with a guru, and it takes place in ancient India. So at that time, the system was that you would approach a guru, probably take a present, maybe some wood, some kindling wood, and offer your services as a mentee and apprentice, so that you could learn from him the deeper aspects of meditation, the Upanishads, yoga, etc. So this young man approaches an old guru who lives in the forest, has a little hut, and the guru takes him on, and he says, okay, your job is going to be to bring water, keep the fire running, make sure everything is in order, so that, by and by, I'll start to teach you what yoga is about. And the young man starts to get impatient, because a lot of the work is simply this carrying water and chopping wood and making sure everything's kind of set up for the guru. So he's always asking, when are you going to teach me meditation? When are you going to teach me about the mind? And the guru says, oh, just be patient. We'll get to it. Meanwhile, he says, go get me some water from a special stream that's a little bit further than the typical source of the water. So the young man goes, he takes his jug and goes to fetch the water from this stream. And while he's gone, he finds a stream and he's filling the jug with water. He hears this ruckus, trumpets and horses and elephants. So he goes to investigate. And sure enough, it's a procession of a princess who's riding an elephant and all her entourage, musicians and jugglers and horses and elephants, marching down the road. And he's so intrigued by the vision and her beauty that he forgets about his errand
And his guru.
and follows the parade.
So he joined the circus.
He runs away with the circus, which was always my dream as a young person. Anyway, he follows the caravan into the city, and by he gets a job and becomes successful so that he's able to court the young woman, and he becomes her lover. They have a great affair together. He's wealthy, successful. In other words, he acquires all the trappings of our modern world nowadays, right? But by and by, he starts to lose these things. The marriage or the relationship goes sour. He loses his wealth and money and abundance. So he gets to a point where he's at the end of his rope, decides to go to a river and throw himself in the river. And
Giving up.
Pretty much given up on life. And he falls asleep right before he's about to throw himself into the river. And when he wakes up, he is by his guru splashing water on his face and waking him up. He had gone nowhere, essentially. His guru had given him this vision of what life would be like pursuing the worldly pursuits, complete with all of the experiences, both highs and lows. And that was one of the great lessons he learned from that guru.
Well, also, I love the idea that the impatience, sometimes we all get in that point, is related in your life. You are reading spiritual work, or you're doing, working with your mind, want to create your life. And there's that impatience, like, where are the goodies? Where are the goodies? And then we end up kind of chasing that external to feel good. And we forget about the reason why we wanted to read the spiritual work is because we wanted to understand ourselves. And a lot of people sometimes get lost in that, thinking, well, I'm going to use these spiritual principles to get material things. And that's where the ego gotcha.
Yeah, it works at so many different levels. Certainly the idea of life being like a dream as well. That, yes, we're experiencing all of these incredible experiences, but they're really occurring in our mind. That's embedded in there. But yeah, let's talk about the ego, because especially in Jung and yoga, there's a big overlap, and some differences.
Freud used the term ego. There's a lot of people that use that terminology, different systems. But Jung and yoga, very similar in some ways.
Yeah, so if we reduce it to what are the functions of the ego in general, first of all, its primary function is physical survival. It helps us survive in the physical realm. It's a really good survival strategy, and we'll talk about why. The second one is social adaptation. It helps us fit into the world. And then the third one is it gives us a sense of self. Right? So let's look at those three elements, both from the Jungian perspective and the yoga perspective.
And how would you define ego? It's really not this permanent part of your brain or your body. It's an idea or a function of arising from you being alive, as having this aspect of yourself. Just like we have digestion, ego is a function of having a body.
Very much so, although it feels to us very real, and most of the time we don't question it. We just assume, well, there's this me, this I, that is doing things and experiencing things. But when we examine it through Eastern philosophy or psychology, Jungian psychology, we understand it's nowhere to be found. It's essentially an emergent property that appears to be there, solid, real, but it's more of a function, like you said. Yeah.
So let's talk about the physical survival.
Yeah.
How does it, I think it's tied to the body and the senses.
Yeah, so from the yoga perspective, the ego kind of drives the senses, or let's say takes in the information gathered through the senses and gives us an experience of the world. But yoga says that's not a real experience. It's an apparent reality. In other words, the world that our senses constructs from gathering all that information is an apparent reality. Very similar to a dream in that it's our own construction, our own inner construction. Now, Jung says something very similar. He says the ego as the center of our conscious mind, meaning our waking mind, takes in all the information and helps us survive by telling us what's pleasant and what's unpleasant.
So the senses receive the information through our brain, and our mind, which is not the brain, our mind is also a function of being alive. We have this personal mind that uses that information from the senses from past memory to associate it with something. And it's very, very subjective in a lot of ways. I mean, there's things that we all see that we find pleasant and unpleasant, but every single person has their own, basically, library of their own sensual pleasures and sensual displeasures.
Yeah, one of our advanced students was asking me this morning. It was a question like this, that if a person experiences distrust early on in their life, does that become the way they project onto the world, meaning that they distrust the world? It shows up for them out there. And yeah, that's exactly right. The Jungian model would say, when you experience betrayal in your life, or you interpret it that way, at least, it might not even be there, but your mind interprets it as someone betrayed me. Therefore I cannot trust others. That emotional imprint stays with you for the rest of your life unless you do this inner work.
It will play out if you don't make it conscious.
That's right. That's right. That would be the Jungian model, that you will project it outward, and you will see that out there as the way you interact with the world.
And Western psychology talks about cognitive bias, and you kind of see the world as you believe is there. So if you believe the world is distrustful, you will look and notice at all the places where and even have experiences where it creates more distrust and more reason to barrier. So you're kind of working against yourself. A very simple example for anyone is to look at when you go to buy a new car. All of a sudden you see that car everywhere on the road because it's in your mind. So whatever you're holding in your mind, and especially things you push away, are actually, you're giving it energy. Your ego presses it out because it's like, we have to watch out for this. So let's, be careful. So if you're walking down a dark alley, your ego's going, pay attention to any weird sounds because it could be an intruder. So it does. And then every little thing scares you. And it's like, this dark alley's scary because you're putting that distrust and fear into the situation. And so we end up in that survival mode in life.
Well, that's exactly right. And that's the point, that why would it play out that way? Because it would help us survive. In other words, we would not need to be enlightened. We would not need to know anything about our own mind, just following that principle, that whatever we experience early on, we learn that that's what we should expect from the rest of our lives. And then if we follow that principle, it helps us survive, because if we survive the initial experience, there's a likelihood that we will survive the rest because we learn how to adapt. But the limitation, of course, that if we follow that principle, we're going to be limited by our initial experience for the rest of our life.
Yeah.
In other words, we're going to live the rest of our lives as if we were in that initial early environment of childhood. And we know that's not the case. Things change. There's more opportunities, et cetera, but we will not see them because of that conditioning.
And where yoga brings in the other element from Eastern philosophy and Jung brought in is that it's not about just changing those conditions. It's about realizing that you're not the ego. And so in traditional psychology, it's all about rewiring the ego, changing the ego, making the ego better. What Jung and yoga have in common is that we want to transcend the ego. We don't want to just shine up the ego. We want to realize that what the ego's doing, so then we can make a choice outside of it.
Absolutely. So the second part then is the social adaptation. Mm-hmm. So once we survive, once we've established
we grow up and we pay our bills, and
that we're able to make it in the world. We're able to find food, shelter. All those are kind of the lower rungs of the hierarchy of needs. Then the second level of hierarchy of needs is social adaptation. We want to be accepted. We want to be part of the group. We want to be seen as important elements or people that are contributing to the group, to the tribe, to the society. And so Jung says, this is the construction of the persona. Mm-hmm. The persona is the mask that allows us to do that.
So the persona is socially constructed, where the physical is more about survival and kind of sense pleasures initially. But then we learn we have to survive socially in our family, as children in school, and then as we grow up with our peers
and
in society, find a mate, find work, people like us. So all that, the social part is actually more of what we see, and the ego sees the social aspect also as survival in a way, because it feels that if I don't have people like me and care about me, and I don't fit into society, it's a threat to your survival on a deep level.
Yes, that's right. Because evolutionary wise, as social creatures, we survived as a group. We did not survive alone.
So this is not about I need to healthy self-esteem, so people like me for me being liked itself. But that's why we feel bad when we get rejected. And so, what does Jung say about this idea? The persona is what he talks about as this mask that we wear to fit in. That's not really who we are. The ego creates.
Yeah, pretty much. The ego then has to, using that principle of good and bad, or desirable and non-desirable, or let's put it this way, adaptive and not adaptive. It says the adaptive elements of who I am and my characteristics, my talent, my skills, I'm going to use them to construct a persona, a role for myself that I can identify with and I can present to the world as this is who I am. But he says that's only a mask, because that's not the totality of our true self.
Because we can't show who we are, because if we have a conflict with what is acceptable. So there's that value conflict that we have of people will only like me if I present this type of persona.
Right. So what happens to the stuff that we push away? That's where Jung says that goes into the unconscious mind, and it will reside there until you do inner work. It will persist there, and it will trip you up, because you will be projecting not only your conscious assumptions about the world, but your unconscious assumptions as well. Or maybe more so, because the unconscious assumptions, you will think, well, I got rid of them. I pushed them away. I
That's not
denied them
me.
in me.
Yeah.
But they didn't go anywhere. They went into the personal unconscious mind.
So there's a layer of conditioning that's survival, and then the social conditioning is another layer on top of that. So it's both. It's not just changing behavior and seeking pleasure. It's about, well, how do I seek pleasure? And that conditioned of I can't keep boundaries, or I can't be mean, or I can't reach certain financial goals because that wouldn't be accepted by my family, don't like rich people, so I have to be mediocre in my income. So all these things affect our love, relationships, our seeking. I see a lot of people who get married just because their family wants them to be married and sees that as a success. And they're in this marriage that looks good on paper, but they're miserable because it's not really who they are, and they're kind of pretending in the relationship. So this social aspect of the mask causes a lot of our pain. It's one of the things that break us in a way. I don't want to say we're not broken, but you know what I'm saying. It's it hinders our happiness. It hinders our ability to have really true love and connection and with relationships.
Yeah, again, because it's a mask, meaning it's not a genuine way of showing up in the world. It functions just like survival is necessary because we need to survive. The persona is a function of ego that helps us fit into the world and get a foothold in the world and say, yes, I can make it in the world with this persona, that I present myself in this way, and my job is essentially to keep the unwanted aspects of myself hidden. And so most of the psychological, emotional energy goes towards propping up the persona and pushing away the shadow, the unconscious, or keeping the undesirable aspects of our personality in the unconscious.
Like you were saying about the woman was asking about trust. So if you push away trust, and that you have to be a trustworthy person, but you push away someone who's not trustworthy, you're going to end up seeing it out there. And it's like repeating, like, I'm not going to be like them. I'm going to be a trustful person. Someone people can trust me.
Yeah.
But you end up getting people that let you down all the time. So it works in that projection again. So what does yoga philosophy talk about the persona and the ego in this social aspect of our psychology?
Yeah, so they don't necessarily talk about the persona, but they do say that the way we present ourselves at this social level is exposing us to the conditioning effect of the environment. Now, we know this from psychology as well, not only Jung, but Skinner, who did a lot of the work on conditioning, that anytime we take an action, if we're attached to the results of the action, we're conditioned by the results. That if we get a positive, meaning that we get what we set out to get, we're rewarded. And therefore it increases our likelihood of repeating that action.
So the guy initially saw the happy music and he was like, ooh, this feels good. I'm going to follow that good feeling. And then he created all those things. But then when it started getting bad, he started pulling away, and it just kind of, it can make him happy, but it can make him miserable.
That's right. That dualistic nature of the reward, positive or negative, right? That if we don't get what we intended through the action, it's a kind of punishment, or it's not reinforcing. Therefore, our likelihood of repeating that action decreases. Now, think of all the actions that we take in a day, let alone a whole lifetime. All those have a conditioning effect on us, meaning they mold and shape our behavior to the point where we're not really making free choices. We're acting out of our past conditioning.
And that's what in yoga philosophy, they call it the samskaras.
The samskaras as well as karma.
Yeah.
Because karma, if you look at what it's saying, it's really, in essence, it's not saying good and bad karma like we're used to thinking about it, although we can think of the conditioning and those aspects. But it's really just the sum total of your past actions that they left a conditioning imprint on you. And therefore, you're not really free. You're acting out of conditioning. And yoga is designed to set you free from that conditioning, burn up your past karma.
So does yoga philosophy say, do not seek pleasure, do not create, wealth and relationships in your life, just discard it and abandon the ego altogether? Like what's the difference, or is there a similarity between Jungian psychology and yoga philosophy where what do you do with that? Like you're an ordinary person, you want to have money, you want to pay your bills, you want to live in the world as a householder. How does that work?
Yeah, so there are two types of yogas presented initially in the Gita, although there's a lot of schools now of different types of yogas. But the idea was that you either renounce the world, meaning you go off into the Himalayas and find a cave and meditate.
Find a guru by the river.
That's right. Or a monastery of some sort, and you isolate yourself from the world, meaning you're dropping the social persona, very similar to Jung's idea of, that you have to be able to transcend that. You have to be able to let go of that social persona. Or the other one, so that would be one way, which is kind of the Raja Yoga, which is a meditation, and inward self-inquiry. The other one would be, and this was really an innovation in spiritual technology at that time. It was the idea that you could continue to act in the world, but you renounce the fruit of the action, not the action itself. You took the action and you did the best you could with the action, but you were not interested in the results, either the negative or the positive. You saw it as completely neutral. What that does, it eliminates the conditioning power of the action.
Well, the ego, right? Because the ego is attached to pleasure or pain.
That's right. And that's right. And so you could continue to take action in the world. You could be a householder and continue to have a job, etc., and still develop your spiritual life through yoga because you were acting with non-attachment to the fruits.
But you can
action.
care about the results. You can care, like, say someone has this desire to help humanity, make the world a better place. It's not like you don't care, because then why would you act anyway? But you dedicate that action. You get your ego out of the way. Basically, you're saying, I want to create this condition, but it's not reflecting the good or bad in me every step of the way. Or else your goals are very, it's like a roller coaster. You're high when things are going well. You're low when things are going bad, just like our friend who ran away with the parade. When things were going well, it was great. But at the other side of the coin is he was so attached that it caused him great misery. So the higher the desire and the joy from that desire comes the depth of the despair from not having it. So you're creating this duality. But if your enjoyment doing what you love, like I am actively taking action to make the world a better place, it doesn't matter what the results are. It's just that you're doing it. You're already successful in your action. So there's no attachment. What the ego does is like, ooh, I am the person that changed the world. I am the person that's a do-gooder, that's doing all these good deeds. And that is a trap that I think a lot of people that want to help others fall into, is that I have to be the good, all-knowing person and have to have all the answers, those kind of things. And you get attached to that.
Yeah.
Am I making an impact? Am I not? And it's all about the ego.
Yeah, absolutely. So attachment itself then strengthens that false sense of ego, that false sense of I, that is the next level of it. the false sense of self, or the initial sense of self that we grew up with, it is a persona in the sense, or a mask, right, that we're wearing, a role that we're playing, in the sense that there is no real I in the way we experience it. Mm-hmm. In other words, the ego gives us a sense of I, or a sense of self, but it's nowhere to be found, and it's not a real solid, true self. Mm-hmm. In that it cannot be seen, it cannot be defined in any way. Because if you ask a person, well, who are you? I mean, reveal yourself to us. All they point to is identification, external things.
Their resume.
Accomplishments. Yes, or their own bodies. Mm-hmm. You know, there are people
or
that
your
believe,
age.
I'm just this body, that's all I am. And when the body dies, I no longer exist. So all those are not really satisfactory answers to that question of who am I? Because there's an awareness there that we cannot deny it. Mm-hmm. In other words, if you ask somebody, do you exist? If they say no, well, who is the one that is saying no? Yeah. So the only obvious answer is yes, I exist. Right? You're hearing the question. You're answering the question. Therefore, there's a presence.
Listening? Yeah.
Yeah. So there's an awareness there that cannot be denied. And yoga philosophy simply says that's the true self. That's the true self in you. But that realization of your true self can only be achieved through cultivating that awareness, right? Through letting go of the false identification of persona, ego, in Jungian terms.
I think of a simple way to think about it is the movie screen. The plain white screen is the self. And then the character, us playing our role, life out in the movement of our life is kind of an illusion. And then when we take that away, we're still the self, just like the boy went away, had the movement of the movie, but when the movie went away, it was like still that blank screen, that pure potential. It doesn't have a name and form attached to it. It's always there. And that kind of that feeling of having that sense of, there's a part of me that's everlasting, unlimited, pure potential is, and not identify that as my ego as pure potential and I as a Deborah am unlimited. It's more like that's the truth. Like it's not a bolstering. You don't need confidence for that. It's really, you don't have to build up your ego's confidence to really reclaim your power. And because your understanding what's there has always been there and will always be there.
So the first teaching in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is yoga is the stilling of the modifications of the mind. That's a rough translation. What he means is that in order to get to that pure awareness that's there, the true self, you have to let go of the ideas, meaning the surface ripples in consciousness or awareness, the thoughts that create the sense of I, the false sense of I. If you can't let go of that, if you believe I am the I because I'm the one that's thinking and doing, that's a false perception, essentially. You're back to ego, to believing you are the false persona, the false sense of self. Meditation in his sutra is essentially a way of getting to that pure awareness, dropping below the surface of the modifications of the mind.
This disturbance on top of the water and going deep into the presence of stillness.
That's right. So that you could experience your true self through samadhi, through nirvana, through this experience beyond thought, which is strange for Western psychology, because Western psychology is essentially based on the idea, or at least initially, that the mind was the object to study, And then it became about behavior and all these
Thinking positive. And
yeah, or all these external kind of observable things that could be measured. But essentially, it's the same idea, especially in Jung, that he's saying, if you hold on to that false sense of I and believe you are the persona, it's going to make you neurotic, essentially. And to him, neurosis was simply this kind of living out your complexes. It would be equivalent to, in yoga,
your karma.
living, yeah, exactly. Living out your karma as your karma ripens and is expressed in your being as you continue in your life. You're simply caught up in your past.
It's like you're a passenger in this. The ego's driving, and you're just going around the same bends that it's always gone, and you feel powerless to change.
Yes. So there we see great agreement between these two, one ancient Eastern philosophy and the other one more modern Western psychology, that they're in agreement. What you get to when you examine the mind is that the I, the ego, is false. It's necessary. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not a bad thing. It's not something we want to get rid of. But it only leads to a sense of survival, social acceptance, and this sense of self that is temporary.
So in Jungian psychology, he talks about building up the ego the first half of life. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so if we consider again that it's the ego is necessary for survival and for social adaptation, then we see that, yeah, the first part of our life should be dedicated to building up the ego and a strong persona. He says, if you don't have a strong ego, you will not be able to do individuation in the second part of your life, because it requires a strong sense of self, kind of an assurance in your capacity to do those preliminary things, which is survive, to be socially adapt and to do your work in a social setting, but then also to transcend it, to go beyond that.
So someone who is really struggling with money and like kind of survival, basically, and scrounging, and or their health in those places where they don't feel like they're control of that individuation, or letting go of the ego might not be the stage that they need to be at. The first stage for them would be to find a sense of self that can basically hold their life together, right? If you feel like your life is a mess and like almost like you have no control over it, you need to kind of have some kind of sense of control. Is that the concept?
Yeah,
that I can, like, even though I can get a job, even though I hate it, but I can get, go out there and meet people and maybe, but it's not the relationship I want, but there's not that kind of helplessness to yourself.
Yeah, because in yoga philosophy, for example, the first stages are not about meditation and going into these transcendental states of mind. They're about living a moral life. You have to be stable in body and mind. And so it begins with yama and niyama, meaning moral certitude, moral education. Then you go into asanas and pranayama, meaning now you start to work with the mind-body so that it's healthy and it's stable, which you have a good platform then to transcend it, to go into those deeper states of awareness.
And so for someone who wants to begin this in their life, how do I let go of my ego? How do I transcend it? I was thinking a really great exercise for you is think about an area in your life where you're discontented. It's relationships, whether it's money, whether it's your career, whether it's health, and or even just your lack of passion in life, lack of purpose. Where are you discontented? And sit with the idea, like this question of, why am I discontented, and what do I think is going to give me happiness? So I'm discontented because don't make enough money. Well, if you had the money, what do you think that's going to give you that you don't have right now? I'm discontented because I don't have the right relationship. Well, what is that relationship going to give you that you don't have right now? What if the health is going to give you? And you'll see that ego attachment. You'll start to see it and become aware of it. And I think that's always the first step, is to be aware that the things you desire and how the ego is desiring them is facing outward. It's not about an internal state. It's that something outside of me is going to give me something internally. And that is the opposite of Jung and yoga. They both agree, that both philosophies agree that it's internal creates the external. And so when you're feeling discontented, you're looking to the future, you wish things would change, you're caught up in ego.
Yeah. And then we see in yoga, of course, the aim or the main practice is meditation. I know a lot of people think of asanas, but asanas are considered a preparatory stage so that it can get to meditation, so that you could be in good health when you meditate. And Jung then uses a similar technique, but he calls it active imagination. He's more interested in what is the unconscious mind going to give you as far as symbols that point to your transformation, to your inner work.
To help you transcend the ego.
That's right. And through active imagination, it was a way to cultivate that communication between the conscious and the unconscious mind. Very powerful techniques that, if done correctly and practiced, they lead to that transcendence of your false self.
I would say both are about turning inward and a meditative state and practices to really question self-inquiry in yoga, meditation, but also the active imagination in Jungian and dream work, obviously. You're really looking, the intelligence within you has the answer versus the answers outside of you. And that's the way to really how to make your ego the first part of life. And then we want to change it. We want to transcend that its grasp, because if we keep hanging on, we'll go to the end of our life chasing chasing the parade. And then we'll go, wait a minute, this isn't really what gave me happiness. And so we all owe to ourselves to find that happiness inside first. And I'm sure you've heard this a million times before. Like, well, how do I find it? And this is the way, is that you first have to identify with the true self, not the ego.
Yeah.
So next week, we're going to be talking about going deeper into the Jung and Yoga philosophies and talking about the unconscious mind. We're going to go deeper into what we introduced a little today.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to recap, then the ego, really good for survival. So we don't want to get rid of it, but we want to understand that that's not where we want to stay, that it's a growth process. That this second stage is this social adaptation function. It helps us develop a strong persona, a sense of self, being in the world, all that great stuff. And thirdly, that it gives us a sense of self, which kind of helps both with survival and social adaptation, but it also gives us a reference point on which to learn who we are and what our life is about. But even we don't stop there, because it's about transcending the ego that both Jungian psychology is about and yoga philosophy is about.
Great. Well, we'll see you next week for another episode. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel or our podcast service subscription on the podcast. And we will see you next week. Have a fabulous rest of your day.